Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm Jon Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. I'm a past member of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee, and currently I'm a district activist leader and trustee for the National MS Society, and I chair the Society's California Government Relations Advisory Committee. The MS Society's Ask an MS Expert webcast is designed to give us a place for the MS community to connect and to connect you with experts who are ready to answer your questions on the topics that impact people affected by MS every day. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. MS navigators are online throughout today's program, answering questions and connecting you to resources. I'd like to acknowledge and thank today's contributing national sponsors, Genentech and SureScripts. Support from our MS community partners helps the MS Society reach its goal of providing up-to-date information and support through programs like Ask an MS Expert. Addressing the needs of people with progressive MS remains a central challenge for MS researchers and clinicians. And while there's been considerable progress in understanding progressive MS, there's still a lot to learn. Today, Dr. Robert Fox joins us to discuss research and treatment updates, as well as share some strategies for living well with progressive MS. Dr. Fox is a neurologist at the Cleveland Clinic's Mellen Center for Multiple Sclerosis Treatment and Research, and the vice chair for research at the Cleveland Clinic Neurological Institute. He's also a professor of neurology at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine. Welcome, Dr. Fox. Thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, hi, John. It's great to join you, and it's a particular honor to be considered an expert. So I'm not sure if I truly qualify, but I'm happy to try best I can.
I have every confidence in the world. Although there's a lot of variability among people with progressive forms of MS, we know that progressive MS is very different from relapsing remitting MS. And I'm hoping you can get us started by walking us through the differences between relapsing remitting MS and progressive MS.
Well, this is very important, and it's a great place to start when talking about progressive MS. In the majority of patients, about 85%, MS starts as a relapsing remitting, meaning episodes of numbness, weakness, blurry vision, double vision, things like that. And it comes from new pockets of inflammation in the brain, in the spinal cord, and in the optic nerve. And when those pockets come on, they disrupt how the nerves work, and that's what leads to the numbness, the blurry vision, the walking problems, and so on. Progressive MS is quite different, and progressive MS is manifest by a gradual, little by little decline in function. It's most commonly noticed in walking, decreased walking duration and walking ability, climbing stairs or running, depending on what is the normal baseline of what a person can do with their legs. Progressive MS can also manifest in the arms of decreased coordination, increased clumsiness, or weakness in the arms. It can also manifest as thinking problems, so memory difficulties, multitasking, being able to juggle the multiple things that people often have to juggle between family and job and their hobbies. And that is a little by little decline and is not abrupt, meaning coming on over a couple hours or a couple days or a week or so, like in relapsing MS, but a gradual little by little progression, usually over many, many months or years.
Do we know what drives progression in MS?
You know, we don't at this point. We think we know what drives the relapsing part of MS. We think that is white blood cells from around the body that, for reasons we're not quite sure, go into the brain or the spinal cord or the optic nerve and attack it in a focus or in a pocket, and does it over a couple days to weeks or so, and then gradually stop over time. We've come to realize progressive MS is not that. And indeed, patients who have ongoing progression don't have new lesions on their MRI or don't have those episodes. So we don't think it's the outside, the peripheral, the circulating in the bloodstream immune system or white blood cells, but rather something from within the brain. Now, there's a couple potential things that have been proposed as causing or leading or driving progressive MS. That includes a metabolic disturbance, an overly stressed neurons, axons, the nerves that are actually serving those different neurologic functions. They get stressed from the previous injury, and that can cause metabolic problems that lead to exhaustion. There's also hypothesized to be the support cells, microglia and astrocytes, which are cells that are supporting the axons and the neurons in the brain and the spinal cord, that they have some derangement that goes on that leads to a decline in the axons and the neurons. There's also thought to be a compartmentalized inflammation. Compartmentalized meaning it's within the brain or the spinal cord, not coming in from the outside. And that may be driving progressive MS in a couple different potential ways. So right now, we don't really know what drives progressive MS, but we do know, or we feel confident, that it is quite different than what drives the relapsing aspects of MS.
Well, I think you've already started answering this question. As its name implies, progressive MS is characterized based upon disease progression. What do we mean when we talk about disease progression, and how can someone know if their MS is progressing?
Well, just over the last few years, as clinicians and scientists, we've tried to clarify and clean up our terms, our terminology when it comes to MS. And we are trying to keep two things separate, and that's disease activity and disease progression. So disease activity is what I mentioned at the beginning, those relapses, new episodes of numbness, blurry vision, double vision, and new lesions on the MRI. That's disease activity. Disease progression is that little by little insidious decline, decrease in ability to walk, inability to run, climb stairs, use arms, thinking, memory, multitasking. And just as the name might imply, it is a gradual little by little decline. Now, it doesn't mean there's that there are not better or worse days, and certainly patients will have days when things seem to just work better and days when things just seem to not work so well. We don't understand that well, and so the ebbs and flows can be a part of progressive MS. Now, to your question about how does someone know if they have progressive MS? They could ask their doctor, but their doctor is going to turn it right around to them and ask them, well, have you had a little by little decline in what you're able to do? Now, the easiest thing to measure or to detect is in walking and how our legs work. So patients will often say, I used to be able to climb up the stairs with an armful of laundry or items from the basement or my suitcase. And now I just can't do it, or I can only walk up half the stairs and I have to stop and wait a little bit and kind of collect myself and then walk up the rest of the way. Or I've had patients who say, after dinner, I used to walk around the block with my spouse and it's a mile around the block. And about a year ago, I would have to rest about halfway at a bench that's there. And then about 6 months ago, I would have to rest 2 or 3 times around the block. And now I just gave up because it was just too hard to walk around the block. And it's a gradual little by little decline. Now, that's the easiest way to measure it, or the most clearly defined for patients. At the other end of the spectrum is cognitive difficulties, multitasking, and memory difficulties. The problem with cognitive is not that it's not real, it's just that a lot of different things can cause cognitive symptoms to patients. So sleep disruption, anxiety, depression, they can cause the brain to just not work so well. And it's often difficult to differentiate what is cognitive symptoms from progressive MS and what is difficulties in getting the brain to do what you want to do because you're not sleeping well, or there's depression, or there's anxiety, or other stressors going on in life.
We heard from Anna, who's been living with relapsing remitting MS for 10 years. And Anna's wondering if everyone with relapsing remitting MS will eventually transition to secondary progressive MS. And is there a test to detect that change?
So the first question is easy. The second question is tougher, Anna. So the first question is no, we don't think that all patients with relapsing MS will eventually progress on to or evolve into progressive MS. We think if we can recognize relapsing MS early enough and intervene with effective therapies, we can prevent or delay, or maybe some combination of the two, patients evolving into progressive MS. So we do think by being aggressive up front in recognizing MS, diagnosing it, treating it, monitoring the treatments to make sure they're working sufficiently, and changing them if they're not, that we can decrease the proportion or the probability of patients evolving into progressive MS. Now, detecting evolution into progressive MS, that's really the patients telling us. And it is a subtle and sometimes hard thing to define. There was a study a couple years ago that looked in the medical records to identify how long it took a neurologist and their patient to figure out that the patient had progressive MS. And on average, it's about 3 to 3.5 years. So that's how long it takes to kind of get the, well, are things gradually getting worse? I'm not really sure. The examples I gave just earlier are pretty clear cut, but oftentimes things aren't quite so clear cut. So there isn't a specific test other than carefully asking patients, how are you doing? What changes do you notice in how you've been functioning?
Managing progressive MS means following a comprehensive treatment plan and using preventive care strategies. Can you share some of the preventive care strategies that someone living with progressive MS might use?
Yeah, so we know that there are many things that can impact how patients function with progressive MS. And we know that things can impact the progression itself. So there are other medical conditions that we have found through research to accelerate progressive MS, and things that you might be a little surprised about. So for example, diabetes and uncontrolled hypertension or high blood pressure can accelerate progressive MS. It can make the disease go faster than it otherwise would. So treating your other medical conditions like diabetes and high blood pressure can help slow progression. We also know that smoking cessation can slow progression in progressive MS, and continued smoking can accelerate it. So things like smoking cessation is something important. There are also many symptoms that are manifest in people with progressive MS that can be treated, that can be reduced or managed at least to some degree. In fact, there are very few symptoms in patients with progressive MS that have no management, no mitigation strategies or treatments, whether it's medications or physical therapy or exercise or things along that line.
Well, again, I think you just started to answer my next question, but I want to dive a little deeper into that. There's increasing evidence that shows that adopting a general wellness program can improve the quality of life for people living with MS. What types of healthy behaviors? I certainly heard smoking cessation, but what other types of healthy behaviors are important? And how does adopting these behaviors impact that MS progression and even overall lifespan?
Well, treating ongoing medical conditions can be very important. As I mentioned, treating diabetes and high blood pressure, smoking cessation. We also know that exercise can be very helpful. So routine exercise, particularly aerobic exercise. Now, sometimes patients will say, well, doc, I can't go running. I'm not able to run anymore. Or maybe they never were a runner. Well, the exercise can be graded or can be adapted to whatever you're able to do as exercise. It can be on a stationary bicycle if you're not able to walk sufficiently or walk safely. For those who aren't able to walk at all, it can be an exercise bicycle that their hands operate, a tabletop exercise bicycle. So there are exercise opportunities for almost any level of ability or disability in people with MS. Now, a common question is about diet. What diet can help with progressive MS? And that has been tricky. There is ongoing research going on, and there certainly are many different diets that have been put forward as potentially helpful in MS, including progressive MS. At this point, the best data that I've seen points to the so-called heart healthy diet or Mediterranean diet, that diet that is high in fruits and vegetables and whole grains and low in animal fat, as being the having the most evidence to support being beneficial in progressive MS.
You also chair the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. So let's talk about progress in research and treatment for progressive MS. But before we get into that, can you tell us what the International Progressive MS Alliance is and explain the role of the Scientific Steering Committee?
Yeah, so the International Progressive MS Alliance is a global effort, a global collaboration between experts in conducting, designing research in MS, foundations that help fund and help promote our understanding of MS, industry partners, people living with MS, basically everyone around the world in different areas and fields that have relevant experience and expertise to help crack the nut of progressive MS. So it is a collaboration. It has representatives from many, many different countries, and it has a formal structure. The membership is driven by the individual MS societies of different countries. They have recruited in the MS experts. There are also industry forum members from pharmaceutical companies that also contribute, and people living with and affected by MS, like yourself, who is one of our people living with MS and affected by MS representatives on our scientific steering committee. The scientific steering committee is the kind of heart and soul of the alliance, and it is the group that defines what the alliance should be doing, what ideas it should be wrestling with, what projects it should be encouraging scientists to engage in, bringing together through workshops and through conferences, experts to try to discuss things that need sorting through, and identifying the pathways forward to solving some of these problems.
At the end of 2021, the Alliance published a paper proposing a global research strategy to prioritize and coordinate efforts to find more and better treatments and improve quality of life for people living with progressive MS. Why is this call to action such an important step in advancing progressive MS treatment and research?
Well, whenever we are faced with a disease or a disorder or a condition in which we've struggled to find treatments, what's critical to do is to go back and say, okay, why are we struggling? where are the problems? Why are we not able to develop treatments? So for example, with the polio vaccine, the biggest challenge was growing polio in the laboratory. Once the scientists were able to grow the polio virus in the laboratory, it was very straightforward to develop vaccines. So the biggest hurdle there was getting the virus to grow in the lab. Well, with progressive MS, we had to look at it and say, why are we not developing more therapies, effective therapies for progressive MS? And three main elements emerged. One was we didn't understand the mechanisms that drive progression. You just asked me at the top of the hour, what is causing progression? And my answer was, we don't really know. There are a couple different ideas of things that we think are involved, but we don't really know what is driving progression. And so one of the focuses is to figure out what that is to then point towards potential avenues of treatment. The second is ways of doing clinical trials in an efficient and short time period, so to do them quickly and effectively. So we have figured that out very well in relapsing MS. We do a short trial looking at new lesions on MRI, and if our treatment reduces the number of new lesions in MRI relative to the comparison group, we feel confident that that is going to be an effective therapy, and we go do a bigger trial looking at relapses. Well, in progressive MS, we don't know exactly how to do those early stage proof of concept trials. We know how to do the big trials looking at disability slowing, so we know how to do them, but we don't know how to identify the potentially promising therapies through short, focused, targeted, inexpensive, what so-called phase 2 clinical trials. And so there's been a lot of focus to try to figure out how can we do that. In essence, it's saying if we can figure out how to fish better, we're probably going to catch a lot more fish. And so this is focusing on how do we fish better, more effectively, more efficiently. And then the third area is looking at well-being, is looking at the overall patient and the different symptoms and the different challenges that people with progressive MS wrestle with on a daily basis, and to identify strategies and pathways towards improving the quality of life, reducing symptoms for people who are living with progressive MS.
What specific projects are you excited about as part of this global effort that the Alliance represents?
Well, some of that is going to be defined. So some of that is what we need to figure out. So a couple specific projects. One is to figure out how to do these studies more effectively, these trials more effectively. And I think that is going to lead to doing trials in a more efficient way. There are three research networks that the Alliance has funded over the last couple of years. These are multinational, multi-investigator and laboratory efforts. Two focused on identifying potential therapies in the laboratory, using different laboratory approaches to find different therapies. And the third is looking at MRI from pooled across many, many, many different clinical trials. So thousands of progressive MS patient MRIs from clinical trials to understand how we can better leverage MRI to understand progressive MS and identify new therapies and measure the potential impact of new therapies on progressive MS. So those are very exciting. And where the Alliance has a really special opportunity is because it's global, because it has reaches into researchers in the laboratory, clinical researchers, clinicians, nonprofits, foundations that are providing funding, industry, and also connections into the government officials, the regulators who can help give input and guidance about developing therapies. That interconnection allows us to pull people together, in a way that really no other group is able to do, because no other group is as global and as interconnected across the whole spectrum of people involved in MS to try to wrestle with the important questions and to plot out pathways towards solutions.
Well, we've already covered a lot of ground, and I know you've helped a lot of our viewers better understand what progressive MS is and what some of the challenges are in unraveling that mystery. Now, I'd like to ask you to share your top 3 takeaways that you'd like our audience to remember.
Yeah, so I think first is that progressive MS is different from relapsing MS. Although, and we didn't go into this, but important to recognize there can be overlap. So we don't think of patients anymore as having either relapsing or progressive, either or, but it's really kind of, do you have active inflammation? Do you have evidence of relapsing now? And also at the same time, do you have evidence of progression? So it is somewhat separate, but we do see them overlapping in the same patient. Slowing progression in progressive MS is difficult. Our current therapies really are not doing nearly as much as we want with progressive MS, but we do have things that patients can do, like treating their other medical conditions, smoking cessation, exercise, dietary approaches, and that most symptoms of MS do have strategies that can reduce how bothersome they are and how disruptive they are to patients' everyday lives.
Well, I want to thank everyone who submitted their questions today, and thank you, Dr. Fox, for being with us.
Pleasure. Happy to join you.
Before we close, I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on multiple sclerosis, please visit the National MS Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups and MS Friends, ways for you to get involved, and upcoming events that are taking place near you. And please remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where I continue the conversation that we start here. You'll find the Real Talk MS podcast at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Dr. Robert Fox for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webcast will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webinar is important. So you'll see a survey pop up in a moment when we close out the webinar. And if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to that survey pinned to the comments section. And on YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Robert Fox and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.